What can people do to resist the tide?
People have to try not to succumb to certain tribal instincts, any kind of propaganda that denote the other as some kind of subhuman. It's been part of the imperial playbook since the Romans to divide and conquer, and it's working now to an astonishing extent. Now, bizarrely, Black Lives Matter and others in that movement are pushing for a kind of segregation.
Praise be Jesus Christ. This is Father Robert McTague of the Society of Jesus, your daily host for the Catholic Current, where we bring Christ to the world and the world to Christ. You're listening to us on the Station of the Cross Studios, your local radio station, and the iCatholic Radio mobile app, where we proclaim the fullness of truth with clarity and charity. As always, let's start with prayer. In the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. Almighty God, through the intercession of St. Ignatius Loyola, we ask that you pour forth your Holy Spirit upon us, a spirit of discernment, that may hear your voice and obey your command. In the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. Well, friends, if you listened to our show on Monday, we had Bill Whittle, well-known political commentator online, and I asked him, what are conservatives conserving? And I want to continue that thread of the conversation and ask, do traditional values and traditional views have a political home? The answer that I could see at first glance is, not so much. And in particular, I want to give a shout out to our listeners at 1060 AM in Boston, because we've got folks from Massachusetts that we're here today with. C.J. Doyle is Executive Director of the Catholic Action League of Massachusetts, and Brian Camenker is the Director of MassResistance since its founding and is its main reporter. Gentlemen, welcome to you both. Welcome to the Catholic Current.
Glad to be here, Father.
C.J., let's start with you. There is an alarming story about a member of the Massachusetts State Legislature, Debbie Martell, who got herself in some very hot water and turns out didn't have a lot of friends in her political party. And I want to talk about that. When I raise the question, I have to make my preface. Number one, I'm not a political partisan. And number two, I don't hate anyone. And number three, I'm not calling for violence against anyone. It seems that I always have to say that, just to cover all the bases. So in that context, fill us in on what happened to Debbie, please.
Well, what happened was she's one of 80 elected members of the Republican State Committee. She's not a legislator. She's not a political office holder, but she is an elected member of the State Committee for the Republican Party in Massachusetts. And she got into an exchange with a homosexual Republican candidate for Congress named Jeffrey Sauce Paquette, in which she indicated that she was opposed to he and his homosexual partner had adopted 2 children, and she indicated she was opposed to that. She said that she was sickened by the idea of homosexual adoption, and he then threatened to bring a quote-unquote firestorm upon her, and that he would expose her as a bigot and make her regret this. And of course, the firestorm quickly enveloped. The promise that he made for a firestorm did in fact happen, and you had the governor of Massachusetts, Charlie Baker, who was a very liberal Republican and a supporter of Planned Parenthood, said her views were abhorrent and bigoted, and 29 of the 30 Republican members of the Massachusetts House of Representatives wrote a letter to the chairman of the Republican State Committee, James Lyons, saying that her beliefs were inappropriate and disturbing. And I would point out that the signatories of this letter included Catholic legislators who were graduates of Catholic colleges and universities, and who vote pro-life, who take socially conservative positions. So they also denounced her. All 3 Republicans in the Massachusetts State Senate denounced her. One state representative named Sean Dooley, who has, I think, a master's in public administration from a Catholic college, Anna Maria College in Paxton, moved a resolution on the state committee. He's also a member of the state committee, calling on her to resign and castigating her traditional Catholic beliefs as hateful and bigoted and repulsive and evil. And of course, the media also joined in this firestorm. The Boston Globe, the Boston Herald, the Worcester Telegram and Gazette, and at least 4 Boston radio and television stations all denounced her. So this became an enormous controversy in the Boston media and in Massachusetts Republican politics. And there was a state committee meeting subsequent to that, and they passed a very kind of problematic resolution. They watered down a little bit the condemnation of Martell. They did not specifically call upon her to resign, but they still endorsed the whole idea of a kind of moral equivalence between homosexual behavior and heterosexual behavior, and suggested that any opposition to homosexual adoption or homosexual marriage was in fact bigotry and intolerance and prejudice. So she was not forced to resign, and James Lyons, who was the chairman, they actually gave an ultimatum to Lyons saying that unless he denounced her, that he should resign. Now, he issued a statement saying that he thought her views were offensive, but at the same time she was a sincere Catholic and she was simply expressing her religious beliefs. So Lyons did not resign, Martell did not resign, and they're both still on the state committee. But nonetheless, the whole Republican Party basically has gone on record endorsing the idea that any opposition to same-sex marriage or to homosexual adoption or any opposition to the whole notion of gay rights, that is, of making homosexuals a protected class in civil rights legislation, is in fact prejudice and bigotry. So I think this is an enormous setback for social conservatives and for people who believe in the traditional family and in traditional morality. And it's also another indication of really an attempt to essentially marginalize and render as extremists in the public eye anyone who holds to traditional biblical and natural law morality.
Brian, in the story that CJ just gave us, I didn't hear anyone talking about dialogue or inclusion. No one sang rousing choruses or all are welcome. I didn't hear anyone say, that the GOP is a big tent and we have to reach across the aisle. Should I be surprised that none of that happened?
Well, it's interesting when you bring up big tent, because that actually was brought up, but it was brought up, of course, in the way that the homosexual movement usually brings it up. In other words, big tent means our values have to be excluded and their values have to be included. One thing that I want to just add to the conversation is this guy, Jeffrey Sosa Piquet, is a candidate for Congress. And that's how all of this thing, started. He's a candidate for Congress against Jim McGovern out in the western part of the state. And so she made the remark in that context, not just that this is some guy, but here's a guy running for Congress who not only is quote married to another homosexual and has adopted kids, but is very, very public about it. At all his events, he brings these his quote husband and sometimes his kids to these events and pushes it in everybody's face. And so Debbie was also reacting to that. And in the letter, as CJ said, that the 29 of the 30 Republican state reps signed, they not only condemned Debbie, as CJ said, but they demanded that the chairman resign, because he didn't demand that she resign, and so he's supposed to resign because he didn't he just did nothing. And so this is how absurd it is, as CJ said. Now the big tent, what they're saying is that we're a big tent party. That was mentioned in a lot of the news coverage where some of the people on the other side were saying we have to include these values. But as I said, big tent to them means including all of the horrible leftist values and driving out conservative and religious values. And so, yes, I would say we do have a reason to be worried about that.
CJ, it's been suggested to me that a conservative these days is simply a progressive in slow motion. What do you make of that observation?
Hillary Belloc made the famous remark that Tories, the conservatives of the day, were people who would argue against something quite vociferously until they finally agreed and went along with it. So that seems to be a kind of common element in conservatism in history. Certainly, if it's not if conservatism is not rooted in faith, if it's not rooted in natural law, or it's not rooted in right reason, it simply becomes a kind of breaking element on the progressive agenda, and this is what the Republicans essentially are doing. The Republican Party has never really been a socially conservative party in Massachusetts. Actually, the socially conservative party, until about a generation ago, 2 generations ago at most, was the Democratic Party. It was the Democratic Party that was it was mostly Catholic, and it tended to be very strongly pro-life. As late as 1978, 40 years ago, we had a pro-life Democrat running against a pro-abortion Republican for governor. And the Republican Party, again, historically has been very closely associated with the legalization of birth control. They lost control of the state legislature in the 1940s because they supported the legalization of birth control and Democrats didn't. Again, it's historically a socially liberal party. And now, once again, even though more pro-lifers have been elected to the legislature, they obviously don't seem to be willing to stand up for natural law and for right reason and for traditional morality when it comes to homosexuality. So I think it's fair to say that the Republican
CJ,
Party
let's take up the thread
vote.
of the conversation in the next segment. Friends, when we come back, we're going to continue our conversation with CJ Doyle of the Catholic Action League of Massachusetts and Brian Camenker, Director of Mass Resistance. The next segment, we're going to ask, where can traditional values find a home in public life? It's not obvious to me. Remember, our rallying cry here at the Catholic Current is Christus Mundo, Mundus Christo, bringing Christ to the world and the world to Christ. We do it because our Lord says so, for the greater glory of God, the love of our neighbor, and the salvation of our own soul. After the broadcast today, go to thestationofthecross.com, get our resources list, download our audio as podcasts. Keep the conversation going. We'll be right back. Stay with us.
Jesus 911, now weekdays at 2 p.m. Eastern.
My name is Jesse Romero. I'm a retired Los Angeles cop. I'm a Catholic lay evangelist. My show on spiritual warfare is called Jesus 911, where you got 3 retired LA cops, Ruben Nava, Eddie Chavez, talking about the Catholic faith and teaching you spiritual warfare, how to defend yourself against the devil, the world, and the flesh.
Catch the Soul Patrol, Jesus 911, 2 p.m. Eastern, 11 a.m. Pacific, on the Station of the Cross and the iCatholic Radio mobile app. You're listening to The Catholic Current with Father Robert Matej from the Station of the Cross Catholic Media Network. Stay connected with the show, our guests and topics, by following the show on Twitter and Gab. Just search for The Catholic Current.
Praise be Jesus Christ. This is Father Robert Matej of the Society of Jesus, your daily host for the Catholic Current, where we bring Christ to the world and the world to Christ. You're listening to us from the Station of the Cross Studios, your local radio station, and the iCatholic Radio mobile app, where we proclaim the fullness of truth with clarity and charity. My guest today is CJ Doyle, Executive Director of the Catholic Action League of Massachusetts, and Brian Camenker is Director of Mass Resistance. In the last segment, we were beginning to talk about the shifting political sands in Massachusetts, and it seems now it's all tilting in one direction, and that even the party that you would associate with an alternative to the progressive movement isn't really very much of an alternative anymore. They're all leaning in the same direction. They're just moving at different rates of speed. I think that's a fair assessment. And what about the people who say, but that's not me? I really do take traditional values seriously. Do I just stay home from now on?
Well, I think it's very difficult, Father. I mean, again, historically, for pro-life Catholics, their home in Massachusetts was the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party is now completely on almost every level, on whether the congressional delegation or the constitutional offices or the legislature or county or municipal government, entirely a party which supports abortion and population control and contraception and condoms in schools and every aspect of the homosexual agenda, and opposes any kind of school choice or parental rights in education. The Republican Party, again, historically has been pro-abortion and pro-population control socially liberal in Massachusetts. In recent years, the Republican members of the legislature have become more conservatives and more pro-lifers have been elected. But again, there doesn't seem to be a lot of conviction or backbone there. I think it's fair to say that the Republican Party in Massachusetts wants the votes of social conservatives and pro-lifers, but doesn't want their values. And I think this is, we have a very, very liberal Republican governor who, again, is a major supporter. He said if President Trump had defunded Planned Parenthood, he would make up for it with state funds. He's, probably one of the most liberal Republicans in the country. And again, even the conservative pro-life Republicans have joined in the condemnation of State Committee woman Debbie Martell for her views on homosexual adoption. So again, people who believe in traditional morality, people who believe in the common good, people who believe in the pro-life position and in socially conservative positions are being increasingly marginalized. I mean, you wonder what really is necessary. Is there a possibility of a third party? Is there a possibility of some kind of Christian Democratic Party? I don't know, but it's the other side clearly, in terms of its control of the media and control of the major institutions of society, would like to see social conservatives and believers in traditional morality excluded from both political parties. And that seems to be the direction we're headed in. So we must, I think the Democratic Party is beyond salvation at this point. So the question is, do we fight a resistance within the Republican Party, or do we find an alternative in a third party, or is there another alternative? In Ireland in the late 19th and early 20th century, when they found that any political effort at home rule was futile, they turned to cultural change and to restoring traditional Irish culture. They had institutions like the Gaelic Athletic Association, and they had the Anglo-Irish Literary Revival, and they had the Gaelic League, the revival of the Gaelic language. So perhaps sometimes people withdraw from politics and concentrate on building their own culture, and perhaps that's an alternative. But I don't know. It's very, very difficult. Clearly, in Massachusetts, at this point, one party is entirely hostile to traditional values, and a second party is those who believe in traditional values are very much on the defensive.
Brian, how did Massachusetts get there? And I think Massachusetts may be a representative case. I don't think Massachusetts is the only state where you can be an aggressive progressive or you can be a reluctant progressive, but you can only be a progressive if you're not going to be harassed out of public life. It wasn't always that way. How did Massachusetts get there?
Well, I think there was two ways that they got there. One, as CJ mentioned, the Democratic Party just went completely left, and the conservatives migrated to the Republican Party. But the Republican, even though they've been able to elect some conservative Republican, legislators, the people that control the money in the Republican Party and basically control everything have continued to be the liberals that have always done it. The Rockefeller Republicans, other people like that, or whatever, the rhinos or whatever. So the people that run the party have not changed, and so that has caused there to be basically no party that that does this. The other thing is that our side has become very cowardly and timid in talking about our issues. A lot of that has to do with the hostile media, but we saw that at the state committee meeting where they passed this ridiculous resolution against Debbie Martell. There are arguably a majority of conservatives on the state committee, because that's how Jim Lyons, who is a religious Catholic, got elected chairman. But nobody said, I agree with Debbie Martell. It sickens me too. And many of these people are very religious Catholics themselves. They didn't say, this is Catholic doctrine and I agree with her. The best any of them could say is, well, she used a bad choice of words, but she has religious freedom or what have you, whatever, And so nobody stood up. And that's another way that the other side was able to sort of steamroll this whole thing. And that's how we all get steamrolled, is because, with the exception of a few people, and CJ is one of them who stands up, conservatives have become cowardly.
Friends, I'm speaking with C.J. Doyle, the Catholic Action League of Massachusetts, and Brian Camenker, director of MassResistance. Our topic today is there any home for traditional values? C.J., part of what confuses me is that it seems that so very few people see that there's really anything wrong, and that there is no alternative but simply to go along with the present trends. So I want to go back to your original suggestion that maybe politics isn't the way to go anymore. When I had Bill Whittle on the show on Monday, he said, we've got to start influencing culture, and we've got to start presenting our own archetypes and icons and heroes and so on. Should we just let go of politics and move into culture war? I know that a prominent cardinal several years ago said that the culture wars are over. I don't remember being invited to the victory parade. What are the options for traditionally minded people right now?
Well, obviously, I think we should pursue cultural change, but we can't give up on politics simply because the other side isn't giving up, and they're coming after us. That they're going to continually try to narrow and constrict our rights and try to essentially crush our value system, and our own institutions are going to be in jeopardy. We've had no Catholic adoption agency in the Archdiocese of Boston since 2006, supposedly because of a state regulation against so-called discrimination in the placement of children. We have continual efforts to force Catholic institutions to hire active, even civilly married homosexuals. We've seen the takeover of Boston St. Patrick's Day Parade by homosexual activists. So the other side isn't going to leave us alone. So we can't disengage from a battle when the other side is still attacking us. Having said that, the difficulty in creating any kind of cultural revival is simply that our own Catholic institutions have essentially been taken over by people who conform to the culture, and faithful Catholics have been dispossessed. Virtually, we have, I think, 11 Catholic colleges and universities in Massachusetts. Every one of them is on the political left in terms of moral issues, in terms of cultural issues, in terms of social issues. Faithful Catholics, again, have been dispossessed of institutions that their own ancestors built. Our Catholic colleges and universities regularly, award honors and give commencement, invite us as commencement speakers, politicians and other public figures who support legal abortion. So the difficulty of creating a cultural alternative is running up against the fact that almost every mainstream Catholic institution has itself become essentially subservient to elite opinion. So it's going to be a very, very difficult task to undertake.
Brian, your work on MassResistance, I mean, you're not an army of one operating out of a basement somewhere. Tell us about the work of your organization.
Well, our organization started, 27 years ago, fighting the sex ed, issue in the schools, and in one town. And we became, a few years later, a statewide group. And now we have chapters all over the United States and in several foreign countries. In fact, our largest are in places like California and Texas. We take a very aggressive stand against the left and against left-wing politicians. And as a result, we're shunned by a lot of conservatives, a lot of conservative groups. But we've had a lot of success. We help parents and others to, demand from their legislators and from their local, officials that these things stop. These things like, drag queen story hours, or, LGBT things in the schools, or, other anti-religious and, just horrible things that are going on. And the left the left is at war with us, and a lot of conservatives just, don't want to realize that they aren't interested in any kind of dialogue or rational thinking or anything like that. What they react to is basically people demanding and screaming at them, and that kind of thing. And the average person can do a lot in their towns just by taking a very aggressive approach. Now, we're not talking about violence or anything like that. We're talking righteous indignation and very very resolute approach. So that's basically what we do. Is we train people across the country to do that, and we've had some success.
Friends, when we come back, we're going to continue our conversation with C.J. Doyle. He's Executive Director of the Catholic Action League of Massachusetts, and Brian Camenker, who's Director of MassResistance. And a shout out to our friends in Boston at 1060 a.m. The next segment, I'm going to ask, why is anti-Catholic bigotry socially acceptable? After the broadcast today, go to thestationofthecross.com, get our resources list, download our audio as podcast. Wherever you can find audio, you can find us. Follow us on the channel, write a 5-star review. We need to attract the attention of the algorithm so these conversations get the attention they deserve. Take it to your family and friends, and together we'll take it around the world. We'll be back in just 2 minutes. Please do stay with us.
This is The Catholic Current from the Station of the Cross Catholic Media Network. Catch up on an episode you've missed or share them with your family or friends. The Catholic Current is podcasted wherever you enjoy listening. Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify, Stitcher, TuneIn, and the iCatholic Radio mobile app.
Praise be Jesus Christ. This is Father Robert McTague of the Society of Jesus, your daily host for the Catholic Current, where we bring Christ to the world and the world to Christ. You're listening to us from the Station of the Cross Studios, your local radio station, and the iCatholic Radio mobile app, where we proclaim the fullness of truth with clarity and charity. We're talking about where traditional values might find a home. My guest today is C.J. Doyle, Executive Director of the Catholic Action League of Massachusetts, and Brian Camenker, who is the Director of MassResistance. C.J., there may have been a time in Massachusetts where people might say, you can't say that or you can't do that. It'll upset the Catholics. It'll offend the Catholics. It hasn't been that way in a long time. Why is that?
It's interesting you mentioned that, Father. There was a radio host in Boston named Jerry Williams. He's dead now. And he once complained that when he went on the air in the 1950s, when Cardinal Cushing was Archbishop, you couldn't say anything against the Catholic Church. And he was saying, thank God now we have, I don't know if he used the phrase thank God, but he was expressing gratitude that you could criticize Catholicism. I think what's happened, Father, is this. Anti-Catholic bigotry was traditionally a province of the kind of the fundamentalist right, something that very right-wing Protestants, I remember my grandfather telling me in 1928 when Al Smith ran for president, Billy Sunday, the evangelical preacher, was on Boston Common talking about how Catholics had guns in all of their churches and were ready to take over the country should Al Smith be elected. Now, anti-Catholicism has become a manifestation of the secular progressive left, and as a result, it's protected by the media. We not only have manifestations of anti-Catholicism in terms of speech and language and writing, but you actually have physical violence. You've had homosexual groups, the infamous incident in 1990, where a homosexual group ended up throwing condoms and shouting obscenities and trying to physically disrupt ordinations at Holy Cross Cathedral in Boston. We've had cases where Catholic churches have been invaded and the Catholic Eucharist has been desecrated. Yet the media does not denounce this. I remember I was on a television program some years ago in Boston with a bigot named Jim Browdy, who was now with the public broadcasting system, so our tax dollars are paying for his bigotry. And it was about a homosexual activist who had disrupted Mass, I think at St. John the Evangelist Church in Canton. And any disturbing an assembly of worship in Massachusetts is a crime. It's prohibited by the general laws, and since 1990, it's been categorized as a hate crime. And there's also a related statute about interfering with someone in the exercise of their constitutional rights. And I went on his program to talk about this, and what he wanted to talk about was not the hate crime that was committed against Catholics, but shouldn't the Catholic Church lose its tax-exempt status for opposing homosexual so-called marriage? So the media protects anti-Catholic bigotry, which is why it's allowed to flourish. And not only does the media protect it, but the government won't do anything about it. In 1990, we wrote to every single prosecutor in Massachusetts, the U.S. Attorney, the Attorney General of the Commonwealth, and the District Attorney of Suffolk County, and none of them would take any action against the people that tried to disrupt those ordinations. I should point out that at the time, the district attorney was a gentleman named Newman Flanagan, and Newman Flanagan was a member of the Supreme Board of the Knights of Columbus of the United States, and he refused to do anything about this hate crime that was perpetrated, this constitutional rights violation which was perpetrated. So the government protects and refuses to act on episodes of anti-Catholic violence, and the media downplays it or ignores it or defends those who engage in it. So it's not surprising that we have such virulent anti-Catholicism today, particularly in Massachusetts. But the Catholic community is also at fault in the sense that they continue to elect these people, and the church is at fault in the sense of that they won't speak out. We had cases just recently in the last year, Father, numerous vandalisms. I think in the last year we've had 14 cases of vandalisms of Catholic churches in Greater Boston. And the Archdiocese, the comments the Archdiocese of Boston made is, we're monitoring the situation, we're working with the police. We need to pray for the poor people who are obviously a disturbed individual who's doing this. That there's no forthright denunciation of this as an act of hatred and an act of violence. So the church itself won't defend itself against these attacks. So this is the Catholic community, I think, really bears some responsibility here for this virulent anti-Catholicism which is afflicting our society.
And I think we are moving in a direction of anti-Christian bigotry in general. In Eureka Springs, Arkansas, there is a 65-foot tall monolithic stone statue of Christ with his arms extended, and apparently overnight some vandals hung a banner that said, "God bless abortions." And I have to believe that if something comparable were done to other types of religious symbols, there would be mass hysteria. But it seems to be tolerated if it's Catholic in particular and Christian in general. Brian, you've been on the ground in Massachusetts for a long time fighting the good fight. Is my perception correct that anti-Christian animosity in general and anti-Catholic bigotry in particular is growing in Massachusetts?
Yes, I think it is correct. And the animosity is, as CJ said, visceral. In the past, anti-Catholic animosity might have been, not visceral, just something, oh, well, I don't like Catholics or something. But what I'm seeing is that it's visceral. It's pure hatred. And in my observation, the reason for that is that the Catholic Church is probably the last church that does not cave in on any of these issues, at least not officially. They don't cave in on abortion. They don't cave in on homosexuality. They don't cave in on birth control. They don't cave in on the principles that the left just absolutely wants to drive out of society, and they hate that. And unfortunately, as CJ also observed, the Catholic institutions themselves haven't been standing up for it, and individual Catholics haven't been standing up for it. But the fact that the Catholic Church won't bend on those issues drives liberals crazy. And to another extent, it's just Christianity in general. Mm-hmm. But that's what I'm seeing. And I'm glad that somebody's still there standing up. But I believe that that's what's happening.
CJ, I'm inclined to agree with Brian. In a certain sense, institutionally, the Catholic Church is the last man standing. It's the only large institution with moral and spiritual and social and cultural resources to draw certain lines in the sand and say, this far, no farther. So, in a certain sense, the Catholic Church is the team to beat. On the other hand, it seems to me that the defense of Catholicism by Catholics is rather lackluster. When I was a new priest, going back 25 years ago, and I was at a self-identified Catholic school, and I'd ask students, "Well, what's your religious identity?" And the most common answer I got was Catholic, I guess. Is Catholic, I guess, writ large now in our culture in terms of people in public life? I'm sort of kind of Catholic. I don't exactly know why, but I'm not going to get worked up about it. Is that a fair assessment?
Yes, I think it's an entirely accurate assessment, Father. First of all, if you look at the Pew Research data, one of the largest religious groups in the country are ex-Catholics now. Something like 1/3 of all Catholics, maybe 40% of all Catholics, have now left the church, and the percentage of former Catholics is now larger than numerous Protestant denominations. But I think it's also, again, a problem within the church and within our own institutions. In 2015, we did a study of the Massachusetts legislature, and what we found was really very disturbing, that if you are an active Catholic, that is to say, if you are a Catholic who is active in your parish, and you're a state legislator, if you're a Catholic who is active in your parish, if you belong to a Catholic fraternal organization like the Knights of Columbus or the Ancient Order of Hibernian, and if you graduated from a Catholic high school and a Catholic college, you were more likely to support abortion than somebody who went to a private school or a public school or was an inactive Catholic. Our own institutions are not turning out Catholics. Our elite secondary schools, our parochial schools, our Catholic colleges and universities seem to be training people to be prosperous, professionally successful, cultural conformists who will contribute money to the institution, but will not in any way uphold Catholic values. Our parishes are not producing conviction Catholics. Not many, but some of our parish priests, give completely ambiguous messages. We had one of the most prominent parishes in the Archdiocese of Boston is St. Catherine of Siena in the town of Norwood, and the pastor there, Monsignor Garrity, came out during the last election and said Joe Biden was pro-life, and that it's not true about Biden being somebody who's pro-abortion. Now, he was rebuked for that by the Archdiocese, but he's still the pastor. If somebody we had a case of a chaplain who had mildly criticized George Floyd, a Catholic chaplain at MIT, and he was fired immediately by the Archdiocese. So there's a double standard here. Our Catholic parishes, our Catholic schools, our Catholic colleges and universities are not producing Catholics. So we should not be surprised that Catholics in public life and even Catholic voters are not defending Catholic values. It goes to this, I think, revolution we had in the church some half century ago, and we're simply no longer growing and turning out convinced Catholics, and I think that's a problem that has to be addressed.
Well, I'm reminded of there was a movement on the campus of a prominent Catholic law school when the students discovered to their indignation that the university was not going to pay for their contraception, and it was so-and-so University Law School Students for Reproductive Justice, and a reporter said to one of the founders, you are at a Catholic school, and she replied, well, yes, I know I'm at a Catholic school, but I didn't think it was that kind of Catholic school. So apparently there are different types of Catholics, and it's that kind of Catholics that has become unwelcome. CJ, are you of a mind that what makes Catholics distinctive at Catholics is it's slipping through our fingers institutionally and culturally? Is that your perception?
Oh, yes, absolutely. I mean, there's simply, first of all, we've had 50 years of or more, 60 years now of ecumenism, which has taught us that there's basically nothing wrong with non-Catholic religions. We have nothing, doctrinally or morally that we would object to. And in fact, by the way, one of the fruits of these 60 years of ecumenism is that various Protestant denominations have instead of moving closer to us, have moved farther away from us in terms of the moral law and in terms of their beliefs about Christian morality. So that has not been, I think, fruitful. Again, our own institutions are completely compromised. Our religious orders are completely it's still the religious orders still control many of these Catholic colleges and universities, and they certainly don't seem to object to the pervasive liberalization, the systemic liberalization that has occurred within these universities. They've also been partially secularized at my alma mater, Boston College. It's in the 1970s, as a result of the so-called Land O'Lakes decision to get, when they decided to get federal funds, the ownership of Boston College passed from the New England province of the Society of Jesus to a new corporate entity called the Trustees of Boston College, which is now a secular corporation. And some years ago, Father Monin, the president, then later the chancellor of Boston College, when questioned about the lack of Catholic identity at BC, said, "Well, we're a secular corporation now. We're the trustees of Boston College." So it was clearly the church itself has allowed. This is the biggest transfer of property, the biggest dispossession, Father, since Henry VIII dissolved 900 monasteries in England in the 16th century. Faithful Catholics have been dispossessed of all of their institutions, their colleges, their universities, their secondary schools, their parochial schools, their Catholic
CJ, we're coming up on a hard break here. Friends, in the next segment, we'll continue with CJ Doyle, the Catholic Action League of Massachusetts, Brian Camenker, Director of Mass Resistance. In the next segment, we're going to ask, what can ordinary people do once they suspect that something is wrong? Be part of the conversation. Follow what we're following by following us on Gab. That's gab.com. Our channel is The Catholic Current. Everything you need to take this conversation to your family and friends, we give to you. Take it to your family and friends. Together we'll take it around the world. We can do it with you. We can't do it without you. Back in just 2 minutes. Stay with us.
And if you notice, there's Catholic bashing everywhere you go. They'll have a whole program about nuns who have gone astray. They're hungering for freedom. What freedom? I got more freedom than all you have. I belong to the Lord God. I'm a spouse of Christ. Oh, what can you give me? A car? Keep it.
The Station of the Cross Catholic Radio Network, proclaiming the fullness of truth with clarity and charity.
After today's broadcast, go to the Catholic Current show page on thestationofthecross.com for info on today's guests, the show resource links, and to sign up for our weekly email of upcoming shows.
Praise be Jesus Christ. This is Father Robert McTague of the Society of Jesus, your daily host for the Catholic Current, where we bring Christ to the world and the world to Christ. You're listening to us from the Station of the Cross Studios, your local radio station, and the iCatholic Radio mobile app, where we proclaim the fullness of truth with clarity and charity. My guest today is CJ Doyle, Executive Director of the Catholic Action League of Massachusetts, and Brian Camenker, who's Director of Mass Resistance. Gentlemen, in this segment, I want to talk about what ordinary folks can do. Brian, I imagine you talk to people who are frustrated, even desperate. They say, we can't do nothing. We have to do something, but we don't know what, we don't know how, and we're not sure if we should even bother. For the people who think they're defeated before they get started, what do you say to them?
Well, I have always believed and continue to believe that the left is a giant house of cards. It is based on, it is holding up a bunch of unnatural principles through fear, through money, through intimidation, and all of those things. And at some point, like the Soviet Union, it will collapse because it's a house of cards. It's not based on reality. And so I believe that just every single little bit of attacking that is useful. And you hear this a lot, but it's really true. Just going out and publicly telling the truth and doing it fearlessly is very, very powerful. And it's also invigorating. I mean, it's just such a wonderful feeling to be free to tell the truth about these things, like writing a letter to the newspaper talking to your school board or talking to your state rep or talking to your neighbors, just saying, no, we're not standing for it anymore. This is how I feel, and I'm not backing down. It has a tremendous effect on the other side. It tends in a little bit to demoralize them, and more and more and more of that will work.
CJ, for people who say, I don't want to be a good victim, and I also don't want to be an army of one because, strays and loners get picked off on a practical point of view. What kind of corporate action can people of faith and goodwill of traditional values do, say in Massachusetts? Because I'm sure our friends in the Boston area, 1060 AM, are asking themselves that question frequently.
Well, I think there's been one hopeful trend in all of this, and that's been there's been between both the recent Supreme Court decision in Espinoza versus Montana to the shutdown as a result of COVID, is that more and more people are looking for alternatives to the government education system, and homeschooling, parochial schools, school choice, vouchers, tuition tax credits. Now, we're not there yet in Massachusetts. We even still have on the books something called the Know Nothing Amendment going back to the 1850s, which prohibits any kind of aid to sectarian, meaning, of course, Catholic schools. But I think one very hopeful trend is the fact that more and more people are looking for alternatives to the public school system, which is one of the principal pillars of power, you might say, for the political left in this country and for the cultural left. So if you can get your child out of the public school system, if you can homeschool them, send them to a charter school, a private school, a parochial school, I think that's something that we ought to look at. I think it's also, politically, it's very, very difficult because the numbers in Massachusetts are very, very small. But there's openings, though, on the very local level, on a municipal level. Brian talked about, local school boards. People should run for school committee, and they should run for selectmen in small towns, and try to you can make some progress there where you can't make progress on the level of, say, the congressional delegation or the level of the legislature. So I think that's a possibility, and I think also the possibility is just again to kind of revive the traditional Catholic faith. I don't think our civilization is going to be saved until the institution that created our civilization, our Western civilization, the Catholic Church, is itself kind of reinvigorated and reformed and preserved, and it's kind of faltering in this country right now. So I think the new movements we have within the Catholic Church towards Eucharistic adoration, towards the traditional Latin Mass, towards Marian devotion, towards Orthodoxy, I think are all things that Catholics ought to support. And if we can reform the Church, I think we can still save Western culture. So this is something I think that Catholics need to do.
CJ, when you quoted Belloc also said, the only two options are Christ or chaos. And I have a book under consideration by a publisher that's called Christendom Lost and Found, Meditations for a Post-Christian Age. And the post-Christian age, in a lot of ways, in the West, what used to be called Christendom, started with the French Revolution in 1789, where the West said, what we're going to do? We're going to organize public and private life without Christ, and it'll be great. And all we've done since then is rack up a really horrific body count. And I think we need to say, well, that didn't work. It is time to come back to Christ. It's time to come back to natural law. It's time to come back to common sense. And I think, if you want to build a fire, you have to start by gathering kindling. Brian, can you talk some more about opportunities for having an effect on the local level? I think, starting a campaign for U.S. Senate out of your basement is probably a low-yield procedure. But what about being an alderman or running for a school board? Do you have much hope for those processes?
Well, Mass Resistance does not run people for local offices, because what we found is that unless you have a majority, it's not going to work. The left tends to, they don't, unless they're outnumbered, they're going to control everything they can. What we have found is more effective is if you have a local group and you're constantly pressuring these people and constantly going after them and constantly, we have turned around really left-wing school boards by just making their lives miserable with just local parents. And so that's what we do. And the left does that, and we can do it better because we have truth on our side. They have to traffic in lies. And
now, when you say making lives miserable, you're not talking about ringing their doorbell and running away, or having angry mobs with pitchforks and torches outside their home. We're not talking about doxing people.
No, I mean, I guess what I mean is, it's probably a bad choice of words.
Right.
I mean, making their political lives miserable by always challenging them at public meetings and maybe letters to the editor, and those. No, we don't. I mean, what we might do is leaflet the town, things like that. We've had a lot of success, leafleting, but no, we don't do what the left does. I mean, what they do is barbaric. So that's, what we mean is making their political lives miserable, not making their actual personal lives miserable. But, what we would have people do, which is part of that, is, call them at home if they're their constituents and say, look, I want to meet with you. Now, we don't tell people to be rude to them or anything like that, but just, politely say, hey, you're my school board member. I'd like to have coffee with you and my friends. And because one of the things that school boards love to do is sit in front of this, in their meetings and let everybody have their 5 minutes to say and then ignore them. So,
that does seem to be a trend. Gentlemen, we've run out of time. I'm very grateful for your good work. C.J. Doyle, Catholic Action League of Massachusetts. Brian Camenker, Director of Mass Resistance. Thank you for being good guests today.
Thank you, Father.
I'm Jesuit Father Robert McTague. Join us tomorrow when we're going to have another lively conversation. We're going to be meeting with Steve Cortez of Newsmax. We're going to be talking about welcoming back the one-income family. After the broadcast today, go to thestationofthecross.com, get our resources list, download our audio as podcast. Through the intercession of Our Lady of Mount Carmel, may mighty God bless you, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Go in peace, and please pray for me.
Thank you for listening to this podcast brought to you by thestationofthecross.com, a listener-funded nonprofit organization. If this podcast has helped you in your spiritual journey, please prayerfully consider donating at thestationofthecross.com by calling 1-877-888-6279 or through our free iCatholic Radio mobile app.